December of 1945, a woman in Upper Egypt fed pages from an ancient manuscript into her bread oven. She did not know what she was burning. Her son, Muhammad Ali al-Saman, had brought home a sealed earthenware jar he had smashed open near the cliffs of Jabal al-Tarif, outside the town of Nag Hammadi. The family was afraid the jar contained a jinn, an evil spirit, so they hesitated before breaking it. When they finally did, and found only leather-bound papyrus books, they divided the codices among themselves and handed several to neighbors. Some pages were torn out and given away. Others were used to light the fire. By the time word reached scholars in Cairo, the damage was done. Pages that had survived 1,600 years underground were ash. What survived the fire is what we have to work with today. Among those rescued codices, 13 in total, containing over 50 separate texts, was one that scholars would spend the next 80 years arguing about. It is catalogued as Nag Hammadi Codex II, Tractate 3. The world knows it as the Gospel of Philip, and on page 63 of that codex, in lines 33 through 36, there is a passage about Jesus and Mary Magdalene that has never stopped generating controversy. The thumbnail you clicked said, "The page they burned." That is not a metaphor. Pages from these codices were physically fed into a fire, and the ones that survived contain a description of Jesus' relationship with his closest companion that the institutional church never wanted you to read. Not because the text says what the tabloids claim it says, but because what it actually says is something far more interesting, far more complicated, and far more threatening to the version of early Christianity that has been handed down to you. This is what the Gospel of Philip actually says, and this is what it cannot say, and why that matters. Before we go any further, if you've been finding this channel useful, go ahead and hit like and subscribe right now. It genuinely helps the algorithm understand that this kind of careful, documented research is what people want to see, and it keeps us able to keep making videos like this one. The text that has survived 1,600 years is not what you were told it was. JJ. Benitez spent decades investigating the gap between the official record and the documented historical evidence about Jesus of Nazareth. His central argument, that what has been handed down to us through institutional channels is not the whole picture, is precisely what the physical evidence from Nag Hammadi supports. You do not have to take anyone's word for it. The jar was dug up. The texts survived. The lacuna in the papyrus is visible. The account of the canon selection process is in the historical record. The argument is not about faith. It is about what the documents actually say versus what people claim they say. For the first 15 centuries of the Common Era, the only Gospels most Christians in the Western world could access were the four canonical ones: Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, plus the letters attributed to Paul, Peter, James, John, and Jude. The selection was not accidental. Between the late 2nd century and the Council of Carthage in the year 397, a process of sorting took place across the Mediterranean Church. Dozens of texts that circulated among early Christian communities were progressively marginalized, condemned, or destroyed. The criteria were theological, political, and institutional, not purely historical. Texts that reinforced a hierarchical church structure with male episcopal authority at its center were preserved. Texts that did not were called heretical. For a long time, we had no access to what was lost. We knew heretical texts had existed because their opponents quoted them in order to refute them. Bishop Irenaeus of Lyon, writing around the year 180, described Gnostic groups in his area who used secret gospels and esoteric interpretations of Jesus. We knew these texts had circulated because someone had bothered to argue against them, but the texts themselves were gone. Then Muhammad Ali al-Saman broke a jar open in the Egyptian desert. To understand what was in that jar and what it means, you need to understand a word. One specific word. A Greek loanword that appears in a Coptic manuscript on page 63 of the Gospel of Philip. That word is koinōnos. The passage, translated from Coptic, reads approximately as follows. There were 3 who always walked with the Lord, his mother Mary, her sister, and Magdalene, the one who was called his companion. His sister, his mother, and his companion were each a Mary. And then, a few lines later, and the companion of the Savior is Mary Magdalene. The Lord loved her more than all the disciples and used to kiss her often on her. At that point, the papyrus is torn. The word describing where Jesus kissed Mary Magdalene is physically missing from the surviving document. The papyrus is damaged at precisely that line. What you see in most modern translations where a location should be is a set of brackets. The scholarly notation for a word that has been reconstructed by inference, not preserved in the surviving text. Some translators have written mouth, others have written cheek or forehead. The honest notation is simply a blank with a question mark. Here is what that means for the interpretation. Every claim you have ever heard that the Gospel of Philip proves Jesus and Mary Magdalene kissed on the mouth is based on a word that does not exist in the surviving papyrus. It is an educated reconstruction. A guess. A plausible inference based on the context and the grammar of the surrounding lines. It may be correct, it may not be. No one can say with certainty because the page is torn. This is the first thing you should know about the Gospel of Philip. Its most famous sentence is incomplete. But the incomplete sentence is not the most important thing the text says. The more important thing is the word koinōnos itself, and that word has a history. For the next few minutes, I need you to hold one question in your mind. If the ancient world had a perfectly clear word for wife, why does the Gospel of Philip use a different one? Ancient Greek was not a vague language. It was precise in ways that English is not. Greek had specific, unambiguous terms for a legal wife. The primary one was gyne, woman or wife, depending on context. Another was a lokos, the one who shares the bed, a term used in Homeric literature and classical poetry for a married partner. Both words appeared in texts about Jesus' family. Matthew, chapter 1. The angel tells Joseph not to be afraid to take Mary as his gyne. The word is clear. Legal, matrimonial. Neither gyne nor alakos appears in the Gospel of Philip in reference to Mary Magdalene. What appears instead is koinōnos, a Greek loanword borrowed into the Coptic text, meaning companion, partner, or sharer. The same word appears in the Gospel of Luke, chapter 5, verse 10, describing the relationship between James and John and the fisherman Simon Peter. The text says James and John were koinōnoi of Simon Peter. Business partners. Fishing partners. People who shared a common work and purpose. No one has ever suggested that James and John were married to Simon Peter. Antti Marjanen, a scholar at the University of Helsinki who spent years conducting exhaustive linguistic analysis of koinōnos across 2nd and 3rd century documents, demonstrated that in the context in which the Gospel of Philip uses the term, it denotes spiritual partnership and discipleship status, a position of elevated closeness and shared spiritual labor, not a legal matrimonial contract. The text is describing Mary Magdalene's role in Jesus' inner circle, not her civil status as his wife. This is not a minor technical distinction. It is the difference between a text that says, Mary Magdalene was Jesus' closest spiritual collaborator and was loved by him more than the other disciples, and a text that says, Jesus was secretly married and the church covered it up. Both of those are interesting claims. One of them is supported by the surviving evidence. The other one requires the surviving evidence to mean something it does not linguistically mean. And here is where the story gets more complicated and more interesting than the tabloid version. Because even if we grant everything the Romantic interpretation claims, even if koinōnos did mean wife, even if the missing word was mouth, the Gospel of Philip would still not be what people think it is. And understanding what the text actually is changes everything. Let me tell you about the Bridal Chamber. The most theologically dense sections of the Gospel of Philip are not about Mary Magdalene at all. They are about a sacrament, a ritual described in the text as the bridal chamber. In the Greek, nymphon. The text treats the bridal chamber as the highest of 5 sacred rites, above baptism, chrism, Eucharist, and redemption. It is described in mystical, symbolic language, a place of reunion between the human soul and the divine, a ritual transmission of spiritual wholeness, a moment of sacred union between the fragmented earthly self and the complete heavenly self. Elaine Pagels of Princeton University, whose 1979 book, The Gnostic Gospels, is still the most widely read scholarly introduction to the Nag Hammadi texts, argued something that permanently changed how scholars understood these documents. She demonstrated that in Valentinian Gnostic theology, the theological tradition that produced the Gospel of Philip, sexual and marital imagery was not used to describe human biography. It was used as symbolic language for spiritual processes. The bridal chamber was not a literal wedding ceremony. It was an initiatory rite in which the practitioner experienced a mystical union with the divine counterpart of their soul. The imagery of partnership, marriage, and intimate union in these texts described a vertical relationship between the human and the sacred, not a horizontal relationship between 2 specific human beings. When the Gospel of Philip calls Mary Magdalene the companion of the Savior and says the Lord loved her more than all the disciples, it is doing something specific within a theological framework. It is encoding, in symbolic language, a claim about spiritual hierarchy and privileged access to divine revelation. Mary Magdalene, in this text, is the figure who received the deepest transmission of gnosis, the Greek word for sacred knowledge, from Jesus. She is the model initiate, the one closest to the source. That is not the same claim as they were married. It is a different claim, and in some ways a more radical one. Because what it says about Mary Magdalene's position in the early Christian movement is not merely that she had a romantic relationship. It says she had theological authority. It says she received revelations that the male apostles did not receive or did not understand. It says she stood in a position of spiritual primacy that the institutional church, with its male episcopal hierarchy, spent the next several centuries systematically dismantling. The romantic interpretation, ironically, is the safer one. A wife is private. An apostle is public. A wife has no theological authority over the church. A primary receiver of divine revelation does. Now, let me show you how far back this dismantling goes. For the next section, I need to take you to a specific moment in history. Not to the Council of Nicaea in 325, which is the meeting most people blame for everything they don't like about church history. The decisive moment for Mary Magdalene's historical reputation happened much later, and it happened through a single speech. Sunday, September 14th, in the year 591. The Basilica of Saint Clement, Rome. Pope Gregory I, Gregory the Great, the man who would become one of the most influential popes in the history of the Western Church, was delivering a homily on the Gospel of Luke. In that homily, Gregory did something with no textual support from the canonical Gospels whatsoever. He merged 3 separate women into one. The canonical Gospels mention at least 3 distinct women whose stories Gregory collapsed. First, Mary of Bethany, the sister of Lazarus and Martha, who anointed Jesus' feet with perfume in the Gospel of John. Second, an unnamed sinful woman who wept at Jesus' feet in a Pharisee's house in the Gospel of Luke. Third, Mary of Magdala, who appears in all 4 Gospels as one of Jesus' most dedicated followers, who witnessed the crucifixion, who came to the tomb on Easter morning, and who in John's Gospel is the first person to encounter the risen Jesus. Gregory declared, from the pulpit of one of the most powerful churches in the Western world, that these 3 women were the same person. That the sinful woman of Luke, whose unspecified sin Gregory interpreted as sexual immorality, was Mary Magdalene. That Mary Magdalene had been a prostitute before she met Jesus. The canonical Gospels never say this. Not in any version. There is no passage in Matthew, Mark, Luke, or John that identifies Mary Magdalene as a woman of sexual immorality. The only thing the Gospel of Luke says about Mary Magdalene by name is that Jesus cast 7 demons out of her, which in the medical and theological context of first-century Judea referred to illness or spiritual affliction, not sexual sin. Gregory invented it, and because he was the Bishop of Rome, speaking with the full weight of papal authority in 591, his invention became institutional doctrine. For the next 14 centuries, the Western Church taught that Mary Magdalene had been a prostitute. Paintings, sculptures, sermons, theological commentaries. She was the repentant, fallen woman, defined by her sin, redeemed by her weeping. Not the primary spiritual confidant of Jesus. Not the first witness of the resurrection. Not the one who, according to the Gospel of Philip and the Gospel of Mary, another Nag Hammadi text, received teachings that Peter and the other male apostles could not understand and did not receive. The Eastern Orthodox Church, for what it is worth, never accepted Gregory's conflation. The Orthodox tradition has always maintained a clear distinction between Mary Magdalene and the anonymous sinful woman of Luke. Mary Magdalene is venerated in Eastern Christianity as equal to the apostles, a formal liturgical title. In the West, she was made into a repentant prostitute. The divergence is not theological, it is political. It traces directly to 591 and one man's homily. And here is the thread that connects all of this to the jar that was smashed open in 1945. The texts that were buried near Nag Hammadi were buried around the year 350. Scholars who have analyzed the leather bindings and the papyrus composition have dated the physical codices to approximately 320 to 375 during the reign of the Emperor Constantius II. This is roughly the same period during which Bishop Athanasius of Alexandria, one of the most powerful church officials in the Eastern Mediterranean, was systematically ordering the destruction of texts that did not conform to what he called the canon of Scripture. In his Easter letter of 367, the earliest surviving document to list the 27 books of the New Testament as we know them today, Athanasius explicitly commanded that apocryphal books be set aside and not read in the churches. Someone chose to bury the Nag Hammadi codices rather than burn them. We do not know who made that choice. Scholars Hugo Lundhaug and Lance Janot, in their 2015 analysis of the physical construction of the Nag Hammadi codices, determined that the texts were almost certainly bound and copied by 4th century Egyptian monks in the Pachomian monastic tradition, not Gnostic sectarians, but Orthodox Christian monastics who apparently treated these texts as advanced spiritual reading material. The most likely scenario is that a community of monks who found these texts valuable received Athanasius's letter ordering their destruction and made a different choice. They placed the codices in a sealed jar and buried it in the desert, where it stayed for 1600 years. If that reconstruction is correct, and the physical and historical evidence supports it, then the people who preserved the Gospel of Philip were not heretics hiding from the church. They were monks who believed these texts were worth saving precisely because they knew what would happen if they didn't hide them. And then, in 1945, a farmer's mother burned some of them anyway to light a bread oven. The pages that survived, the pages that didn't become ash, contain a document that was written somewhere between 150 and 250 years after the crucifixion. The Gospel of Philip is not an eyewitness account. It is not a biography of Jesus, it is not a secret diary or a suppressed historical record. The scholarly and linguistic consensus is that it was composed in Syria or Egypt sometime in the middle of the 2nd century at the earliest, more than 150 years after the death of the Apostle Philip, whose name it carries. The Philip of the title was probably used as a pseudonymous authority, a common practice in ancient religious literature across traditions. The actual author is unknown. What the text is, what it was clearly designed to be, is a theological meditation on the Valentinian Gnostic sacramental system. It teaches that there are 5 sacred rites. It teaches that light and darkness are in opposition. It teaches that spiritual names carry power. It teaches that the world as we perceive it is a copy of a higher reality, and that human souls contain a fragment of divine light that can be returned to its source through specific initiatory practices. It is dense, symbolic, occasionally cryptic, and, in the sections that have survived intact, theologically sophisticated in ways that require specialized knowledge of 2nd century Gnostic thought to fully interpret. None of this makes it less important. It makes it more important in different ways than the Romantic interpretation suggests. Because what the Gospel of Philip preserves is evidence. Evidence of something the institutional church worked very hard to bury, literally and figuratively. The fact that the movement that formed around Jesus in the 1st and 2nd centuries was not monolithic. It was not uniform. It was not led exclusively by men. It was not agreed upon theological territory. It was a contested, diverse, argumentative, vital set of communities spread across the Mediterranean world, each interpreting the figure of Jesus through their own cultural and theological frameworks. Some of those communities gave Mary Magdalene a place at the center of the tradition. Some of those communities believed that spiritual authority was transmitted through sacred knowledge rather than ecclesiastical hierarchy. Some of those communities had women in leadership positions, and those communities and their texts were systematically excluded from the tradition that survived to define what Christianity is. Karen L. King, a scholar at Harvard Divinity School who has spent decades examining non-canonical papyri, including a controversial fragment about a wife of Jesus that later proved to be a modern forgery, has argued in her careful scholarly work that the canonical selection of texts was not simply a process of preserving what was historically accurate and discarding what was not. It was a process through which questions of authority, who gets to speak for Jesus, whose interpretation counts, who leads the community, were fought out and settled. The texts that were preserved were the ones that supported the side that won those arguments. The texts that were buried were the ones that supported other answers to those questions. This is what is sitting in the lacuna of page 63 of the Gospel of Philip. Not necessarily the word mouth, something larger. The evidence of a debate that happened nearly 2,000 years ago, a debate about who Mary Magdalene was, what role she played, what kind of authority she had, and what the movement Jesus started was supposed to be. Let me tell you what we know for certain, not what we speculate. We know the Gospel of Philip exists. We have it. It was physically buried in the desert for 1,600 years, and a farmer dug it up in 1945. It survived. Parts of it did not, including part of a sentence on page 63, line 35. We know the surviving text calls Mary Magdalene the koinōnos of Jesus, companion, partner, sharer, and says Jesus loved her more than all the other disciples. We know the word koinōnos in the Greek linguistic tradition from which it was borrowed means partnership, not matrimony, and that the ancient Greek language had specific unambiguous terms for wife that do not appear anywhere in the Gospel of Philip in connection with Mary Magdalene. We know that in Valentinian Gnostic theology, the imagery of marital union and the bridal chamber was symbolic language for mystical spiritual experience, not biographical fact. We know the text was written between 150 and 250 years after the death of Jesus in Syria or Egypt by an unknown author writing in a Coptic literary tradition that was already a century removed from the Aramaic-speaking world of 1st century Galilee. We know Pope Gregory I, in the year 591, made a claim about Mary Magdalene's identity that had no textual support in any of the canonical Gospels, and that transformed her institutional reputation in the Western Church for the next 1,400 years. We know someone chose to seal these texts in a jar and bury them in the Egyptian desert rather than obey the order to destroy them. And we know a woman burned some of those pages in a bread oven before anyone could tell her what they were. Now, here is the question the texts leave open, and it is not the question the tabloids want to ask. The tabloids want to ask, were Jesus and Mary Magdalene married? The honest answer to that question is, the surviving evidence does not support that claim, and the text that is most often cited as evidence uses a word that does not mean wife in the language from which it was borrowed. The more interesting question, the one the evidence actually provokes, is this: why did it matter so much? If the Gnostic communities that produced the Gospel of Philip simply believed that Mary Magdalene was Jesus' spiritual collaborator and primary student, why did the process of canon formation invest so much energy in reducing her? If she was merely a companion in the generic sense, why did Gregory I spend his sermon collapsing her identity into that of an unnamed sinful woman? If her role in the movement was minor, why does the Gospel of Mary, another Nag Hammadi text found in a different location years earlier, portray Peter as angry at her, questioning why Jesus would reveal things to a woman that he did not reveal to men? The text does not answer that question. The lacuna in the papyrus does not answer it. But the fact that the question exists, that someone in the 4th century thought these documents were worth burying and protecting, and that someone in the 6th century thought her reputation was worth permanently damaging, tells us something. It tells us that the stakes were real. The stakes were not romantic, they were theological and institutional. The question of who Mary Magdalene was is the question of who gets to speak for Jesus. Who has authority? Whose interpretation counts? In the 2nd and 3rd centuries, that argument was live. By the 6th century, in the Western Church, it was settled. Mary Magdalene lost. She became the penitent prostitute, the weeping woman, the sinner redeemed. Not the koinōnos. Not the beloved disciple who received what the others did not. Not the one at the tomb on Easter morning whose testimony began the entire tradition of resurrection witness. The Gospel of Philip does not prove Jesus was married. What it proves, what it preserves on its damaged, partially burned, 1600-year-old pages, is that there was a version of early Christianity in which Mary Magdalene occupied a position of such theological importance that the institutional church found it necessary over several centuries to erase it. That is not a romantic story, it is a political one, and it is far more disturbing. Now look at where this pattern appeared geographically, because if you are thinking that this was a uniquely Western, uniquely Roman Church problem, the evidence points in a different direction. The Gospel of Mary, discovered not at Nag Hammadi, but in a separate Egyptian find in 1896, in a fragment known as the Berlin Gnostic Codex, was written in Greek sometime in the 2nd century and circulated in communities that stretched from Egypt to Syria to Asia Minor. In this text, after the resurrection, Jesus appears to Mary Magdalene alone and gives her a private revelation about the nature of the soul and its journey through the material world. She then shares this revelation with the other disciples. Peter responds not with gratitude, but with open hostility. He says, "Did he really speak with a woman without our knowledge and not openly? Are we to turn about and all listen to her? Did he prefer her to us?" The disciple Levi rebukes Peter, saying, "Peter, you have always been hot-tempered. Now I see you contending against the woman like the adversaries. But if the Savior made her worthy, who are you to reject her?" This text, circulating in communities from Egypt to Syria to the edges of the Roman Empire and the Persian border, shows us that the argument was happening everywhere, not just in Rome. It was happening in Greek. It was happening in Coptic. It was happening in communities that had no institutional connection to Gregory I and no investment in the specific political debates of the Western Church. The conflict over Mary Magdalene's authority was not Roman, it was Mediterranean-wide, and in each region, the resolution was the same. The texts that granted her theological primacy were suppressed, buried, or destroyed, and the version that survived was the one in which she had none. In Syria, the Didascalia Apostolorum, a church manual written in Greek in the 3rd century, explicitly argued that women should not baptize or exercise liturgical authority, citing the example of the apostles themselves. This document was produced in a region where the Gospel of Philip and texts like it were almost certainly in circulation. It was a direct response to communities that operated differently. In Egypt, the Pachomian monks who almost certainly copied the Nag Hammadi texts were themselves operating under institutional pressure from Alexandria, where bishop after bishop had condemned Gnostic and non-canonical readings of the Jesus tradition. They preserved what they preserved despite the pressure. And then the jar was sealed. In the Western Church, Gregory gave his sermon. 3 different regions, 3 different centuries. One consistent pattern. The argument over Mary Magdalene's authority was alive, contested, and ultimately resolved in the same direction everywhere the institutional church gained dominance. Not because the evidence favored that resolution, because the institutional structure that produced the resolution controlled what evidence survived to be read. This is what the modern reader encounters when they first hear about the Nag Hammadi texts, and the reaction is almost universal in its consistency. In online forums about religion and biblical history, on Reddit, on YouTube, in theology comment sections, there is a comment that appears in some form in almost every discussion of the Gospel of Philip. It takes different shapes. Why didn't anyone tell us these texts existed? Or, I spent 12 years in Catholic school and no one mentioned these codices. Or, how is it possible that a farmer found these jars in 1945 and I heard about it for the first time last week? The frustration in those comments is not primarily about Jesus or about Mary Magdalene. It is about the gap between what was available to know and what was actually taught. It is the feeling of having been managed. Not lied to exactly, but selectively informed in ways that prevented you from asking certain questions. The texts existed. The scholarship on them has been available since the 1950s. Elaine Pagels' book about them won the National Book Critics Circle Award in 1979 and has been in print continuously for nearly 50 years. And yet the majority of people who grew up in churches, Catholic, Protestant, evangelical, encountered none of it. The account that arrives like a tabloid shock. Jesus was secretly married is actually a symptom of something else. The recognition that a significant body of documented historical material was withheld from people who had a reasonable expectation of being given access to it. The sensationalism is a response to the gap. Not the right response, perhaps. But the gap is real. What the texts actually say is less dramatic and more serious than the tabloid version. The papyrus is torn. The word is missing. The language does not mean what people claim it means. But the institutional decision to ensure these texts were unavailable to ordinary readers for 1,600 years, that is not a gap in a papyrus. That is a choice, a sustained, documented, multi-generational choice. And now you are on the other side of it. If you have stayed with this until now, you are already in a different place than most people who have ever seen a headline about the Gospel of Philip. You know what koinōnos actually means. You know what the Bridal Chamber actually refers to. You know that the most famous line in the text describes a kiss whose location is not preserved in the surviving papyrus. You know when the document was written, what tradition produced it, and why it was buried. You know about Gregory's sermon in 591 and what it did to Mary Magdalene's reputation. That is not a small set of things to know. Most people who share opinions about this text have never read it. Most people who cite it have never looked at the Coptic. Most people who believe it proves something about Jesus' private life have never asked what koinōnos meant to a Greek speaker in the 2nd century. You have now asked those questions. And the answers lead somewhere the simple story does not. Here is where I want to leave you with something to sit with. The most revealing part of the Gospel of Philip is not the passage about Mary Magdalene. It is the passage about names. The text says, "Names given to worldly things are very deceptive, for they divert our thoughts from what is correct to what is incorrect." Thus, one who hears the word God does not perceive what is correct, but perceives what is incorrect. The text is talking about the gap between the word and the thing, between the name and the reality it points toward, between what survives on the page and what it was trying to communicate. The lacuna in line 63, line 35 is not the only tear in this text. The entire document comes to us across 1,600 years of desert storage, ecclesiastical suppression, fire, and selective translation. We read it through layers of interpretation, institutional interest, and theological investment. The word that is missing on page 63 is not the only word we cannot be certain of, but something survived. Pages that a woman in 1945 used to light her oven became ash. Others survived because someone had the presence of mind to seal them in a clay jar and bury them deep enough that they waited for us. Whatever was on the pages that burned, we will never know. Whatever is in the tear on line 63, we will never know for certain. What we do know is that someone decided these texts were more dangerous if they could be read than if they could not, and someone else decided they were worth protecting. And then a farmer broke a jar open in the Egyptian desert and changed what we thought we knew about the first 2 centuries of Christianity. That choice, the choice made somewhere in 4th century Egypt by an unknown monk or a community of monks, to seal these pages and leave them for whoever came next, is the reason you can watch this video. It is the reason scholars like Elaine Pagels and Antti Marjanen spent their careers excavating the meaning of these texts. It is the reason we can have this conversation. The page they burned is gone, but the page that survived is asking a question that the institutional tradition has never fully answered, and that question is not about who Jesus kissed or where. The question is, who decided what you were allowed to know? And what did they decide you were not? If you have an answer to that, or if you think I got something wrong here, which is entirely possible and I genuinely want to know, say it in the comments. The evidence is in the text. The text is in the desert jar. The jar is in the museum in Cairo. Go look, I'll be here.